They laughed when Caleb Mason paid $10 for the land everyone called cursed. The cabin was broken, the well long dry, and the valley whispered with stories of loss. But the first night, when his gray mare Juniper refused to drink and struck her hooves against the ground, Caleb realized he hadn't bought a home. He had stepped onto a wound, one that pulsed with a terrifying truth waiting to be unearthed. The old courthouse in Madison smelled of dust, pine smoke, and old wool, as though the building itself had lived through too many winters. Ceiling fans turned too slowly to stir the heat, their creaks louder than their purpose. Farmers with sun-cracked faces filled the benches, their boots tapping restlessly, while ranchers leaned against the back wall, arms folded tight. Everyone was there to witness the ritual of loss. Foreclosures, auctions, and the picking apart of lives once rooted in soil. At the front, the auctioneer rattled off items with the weariness of repetition. A broken wagon wheel, a mule past its prime, a patch of rocky ground too dry for planting. Laughter rolled through the room at bargains struck, the kind of rough humor that masked unease. Then the man cleared his throat, shifted his papers, and announced the last parcel with hesitation. Old Mason Creek Ranch, 160 acres, abandoned 15 years. One cabin, one well, one stable, condition unknown. Opening bid, $10. The room fell silent, as though air had been sucked out. Eyes turned down, boots scraped on the floor, and whispers stirred. Everyone in Madison knew the stories. Cattle lost without a trace, water that tasted wrong, a family who had vanished as if swallowed by the land. No one wanted that ground, no matter how cheap. In the back, Caleb Mason sat alone, hat pulled low. He was 37, lean from hard work, his face marked by lines that came from wind more than years. Since his wife's death in Vermont's floods 2 autumns ago, silence had been his closest companion. He didn't fidget or trade glances like the others. He simply rose, unfolded a worn $10 bill, and held it out. His voice was steady, almost soft. 10. The auctioneer blinked, half expecting a laugh, half hoping for another hand to rise. But none did. $10 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 11? The room stayed mute. Farmers shook their heads. One woman muttered, "God help him." And before anyone could stop it, the gavel came down. Sold. $10. A ripple of disbelief rolled through the crowd. Some smirked, others looked away with pity. Caleb walked forward, his boots slow but sure. He laid the bill on the table, signed the yellowed deed, and tucked it into his pocket. Outside, the courthouse door swung shut behind him with a hollow thud. The street glared bright with late summer sun. Dust lifted off the ground in golden veils. Children pointed from the saloon porch. "Mister, you bought the haunted ranch!" They laughed and darted off, their bare feet scattering gravel. Men leaned against railings, shaking their heads. One spat and whispered, "He won't last the winter." Caleb said nothing. At the hitching post, a gray mare lifted her head, ears flicking toward him. Her coat was the color of ash after fire, her eyes wide and intelligent. She had scars near her shoulder, remnants of a life before him, a life likely marked by hunger and neglect. He had named her Juniper for the hardy trees that clung to rocky slopes even in drought. Caleb placed a hand along her neck. "It's ours now," he murmured. Juniper shifted uneasily, blowing hot breath, her ears tilting toward the hills beyond town. Caleb followed her gaze to the horizon, where the mountains rose, silent and indifferent. He swung into the saddle, adjusted his worn hat, and touched his heels to her sides. As they trotted out of Madison, whispers followed like dust. Some pitied, some mocked, but none dared ride with him. Caleb Mason had bought a ranch for $10, a place no one else would touch. Juniper's hooves struck the dirt road in a steady rhythm, but her head tossed, nostrils flaring. She sensed something beneath the quiet, something the townsfolk called a curse. Caleb straightened in the saddle, the folded deed pressing against his chest. "Easy, girl," he said softly, though his voice carried the weight of a promise. "Whatever's waiting out there, we'll face it together." Juniper answered with a sharp snort, stamping once at the ground, the sound ringing like a warning. Caleb didn't look back. The town shrank behind them, swallowed by sun and silence, as horse and rider turned toward the abandoned land that waited with its secrets. The road out of Madison wound through a wide valley, sunburned grass stretching in brittle patches to the horizon. Caleb Mason rode in silence, his shoulders loose, but his eyes fixed on the land ahead. Juniper carried him with a restless gait, tossing her head as though each shadow along the trail demanded her attention. Every few steps she shied from something invisible, ears flicking back and forth, her breath sharp in the dry air. Caleb leaned forward, his hand steady on her neck. "Easy, girl," he murmured, though his voice sounded like he was steadying himself as much as the horse. By late afternoon, the landscape shifted. Fences slumped sideways, their posts gray and splintered. The outline of the ranch rose in the distance, a cabin hunched low against the earth, its roof missing shingles, a stable sagging at the corners, and beyond it all, a well at the heart of the yard, its wooden frame bleached by years of sun. Caleb pulled Juniper to a halt. Dust swirled around them, and for a moment the place looked less like a ranch and more like a memory that refused to fade. Juniper stamped the ground hard. Her hooves struck a hollow sound that traveled up through Caleb's boots. She tossed her head and snorted, drawing back from the well as if the air carried something sour. Caleb dismounted, the weight of his boots sinking into powdery earth. He walked slowly to the edge of the well, ran his hand along the dry wood, and listened. The wind threaded down into the shaft, carrying back a sound that was neither echo nor silence. Something caught between. He felt Juniper's eyes on him, sharp and unblinking. "Not yet," Caleb said aloud, more to reassure her than himself. He pulled the rope at the winch. The bucket creaked upward, its iron handle groaning. When it surfaced, the water inside was shallow, cloudy, and carried a faint chemical tang. Caleb dipped a hand in, lifted a palmful to his nose. The smell made him pause. He didn't drink. Juniper refused to step closer, her hooves scraping lines in the dirt as she backed away. The cabin door hung crooked on its hinges. Caleb pushed it open and was met by a wash of stale air. Mildew, dust, and the faint tang of cold ash from a fireplace long dead. He left the door open to the sun, set his gear inside, and returned to the yard. The silence around the ranch pressed heavy. Not a bird, not an insect, just the faint creak of wood and the restless shifting of his horse. He worked methodically through the evening, checking the stable, clearing loose boards, stacking a small pile of firewood. Simple labor steadied his breath. When he glanced toward the well again, Juniper stood with her body angled away, eyes fixed on the cottonwoods that lined the property's edge. She pawed at the dirt once, hard, and let out a sharp, cutting whinny. Caleb crossed to her, ran a hand down her neck, and felt the tremor beneath her skin. "What is it?" he asked quietly, though he didn't expect an answer. Juniper lifted her head toward the trees, ears pricked. A gust carried through, dry and metallic, like the scent of old wire or rusted iron. Caleb narrowed his eyes. Night fell with sudden swiftness. The sky turned violet, then black, stars sharp against the vast Montana dark. Caleb lit a lantern in the cabin, its glow spilling weakly across the yard. Juniper stayed tethered nearby, but she didn't settle. Her ears twitched at every sound, and she stamped so often that the rhythm kept Caleb awake. When he stepped outside, the mare jerked her head toward the well, nostrils flaring. He followed her gaze. The wind had died, yet the frame above the well swayed slightly, rope shifting with a faint creak. Caleb stood a long moment in the yard, feeling the weight of the deed in his pocket and the silence pressing down. Juniper pawed the ground again, the sound hollow, as though the earth itself were warning them both. Caleb drew a long breath and tightened her reins to the porch post. "All right," he said, his voice low, carrying the firmness of a vow. "We'll face it together. But not tonight." The lantern light caught Juniper's eyes, bright and wary, as if she understood. Caleb turned back toward the cabin, leaving the mare standing guard against the dark. Behind them, the old well shone pale in the starlight, a circle of silence waiting for dawn. The next morning, Caleb rode Juniper back into town. The mare's hooves struck the dirt road with a rhythm that echoed the weight in his chest. The valley lay behind him, silent, as if the land itself had held its breath all night. He had not slept more than a handful of hours, his thoughts returning again and again to the way Juniper refused the well, to the smell of water that carried a strange metallic bite. He hoped for answers, though he knew better than to expect them in a place like Madison. The inn sat along the main street, its wooden sign faded by wind and sun, the lettering just clear enough to promise food and lodging. Caleb pushed open the door, and the smell of coffee, tobacco, and pine soap folded around him. Conversations thinned as men glanced up, then back to their plates, their silence sharper than their words. He had already been marked as the fool who spent $10 on a curse. That kind of reputation clung fast. Behind the counter stood a woman with dark hair streaked silver, pinned loosely at her nape. Her eyes were flint bright, sharp, as though they had cut through many lies. She was not young, but there was something rooted about her, like an old tree weathered by wind yet still standing. This was Dr. Lila Hart, the town's only veterinarian, though her presence carried an authority that stretched far beyond medicine. She poured coffee into a mug and set it down with a measured hand. "You're the one who bought Mason Creek Ranch," she said, not as a question but a quiet verdict. Caleb nodded once and accepted the mug. The steam rose between them, bitter and dark. He took a sip, and the warmth steadied his throat. $10, he said simply. $10 for land nobody will touch. Lila leaned against the counter, her voice level but edged. "You'll need more than coffee to survive out there." Caleb met her gaze without flinching. "I didn't buy it to run. A place is just land until someone works it." She studied him for a moment, then her expression softened slightly. "I've seen what that land does to horses. I've had them brought to me sick, skin drawn tight, eyes clouded. Always from the same valley. Always after drinking from that well. Her voice lowered. It's not just bad water. It takes more than it should. Animals know things we don't. As if summoned by her words, Juniper's hoof struck the porch outside, a sharp stamp that rattled the floorboards. Caleb's eyes flicked to the door. She won't go near it, he said quietly. Trust her, Lila replied without hesitation. A horse doesn't lie. If she refuses, listen. She straightened and wiped her hands on her apron. There are stories, Mr. Mason. Families who tried to settle that place. Livestock gone missing. Some say the ground is hollow, that it swallows more than water. But no one speaks too loud. It's easier to call it cursed and look away. Caleb drank slowly, the bitterness filling his mouth, the silence of the room pressing in again. He could feel the weight of eyes on his back, the townsfolk pretending not to watch. The word cursed carried no more truth than the laughter at the auction. Yet Juniper's restless breath the night before, the sour water, the swaying frame of the well, those were things he could not dismiss. Lila's voice softened, almost kind. You've lost something, haven't you? That kind of silence doesn't come from nowhere. For a moment, Caleb said nothing. His jaw tightened, his hand wrapped tighter around the mug. Vermont rose in his mind, the roar of floodwater, the house crumbling, the look on his wife's face the last time he saw her. He set the mug down with care. I didn't come here to bury myself in the past. I came to start over. Lila held his eyes for a long moment, then nodded once, as though she understood more than he said. Then start by listening to your horse. Juniper may know what you're not ready to face. The inn door creaked as a miner stepped inside, boots scuffing, and the spell of the moment broke. Caleb adjusted his hat and moved toward the door. Outside, Juniper pawed the ground, ears twitching. He rested a hand on her neck, felt the warmth of her skin, and for the first time in months, he let himself breathe easier. But as he swung into the saddle, he caught Lila's voice drifting after him. Some secrets don't want to stay buried, Mr. Mason. Be careful what you dig for. Caleb rode on, the morning sun striking hard across the street. Juniper's stride quickened, as if eager to leave the weight of the town behind. He thought of Lila's words, of the way her eyes had carried both warning and pity. Secrets. Water. Hollow ground. He glanced toward the horizon where his ranch lay waiting, and his grip tightened on the reins. Easy, girl, he whispered, though his voice trembled in the dry wind. Juniper's ears flicked back to him, then forward again, alert to something only she could hear. And with that, they turned once more toward the land that carried both promise and threat, their shadows long on the road. Dusk bled across the sky in long streaks of copper and violet as Caleb guided Juniper back toward the ranch. The mare moved reluctantly, her gait uneven, as though each step closer to the valley pulled her deeper into unease. Caleb felt her hesitation in the taut line of the reins, but he pressed on, his eyes fixed on the outline of the cabin. The land had a stillness that was not peace, but pause, as if the earth were waiting for something to stir. He set about small tasks to occupy the silence. He mended a section of fence with nails pulled from an old crate, stacked dry wood by the cabin door, and checked the roof for leaks. The labor steadied his breath, but each hammer strike echoed strangely, hollow and sharp, as if the boards beneath him carried more emptiness than timber. By the time the sun dipped fully behind the ridges, shadows stretched long and deep across the yard. Juniper remained tethered nearby, muscles tense beneath her gray coat. She refused to graze, instead lifting her head again and again toward the cottonwoods at the property's edge. Caleb poured grain into a bucket, set it before her, and watched as she only pawed the ground, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. When the moon rose, pale and distant, the night thickened with a silence too complete. Caleb lit a lantern inside the cabin, the small flame pushing back the dark. He laid out his bedroll, but his ears stayed sharp. The boards creaked under his boots, though no breeze stirred. He sat by the window and watched Juniper's shadow shift in the lantern's glow. Then it came. A sound that did not belong. A metallic groan, faint but clear, rising from the direction of the well. Caleb froze, the lantern flame flickering. Juniper jerked her head up, gave a sharp, piercing whinny, and struck the ground with both front hooves. The sound cracked across the valley like a warning. Caleb grabbed his rifle, not out of fear of bandits, but because something in him demanded he not face the night empty-handed. He stepped outside, the lantern casting his shadow long across the yard. The well loomed pale in the moonlight, rope swaying through the air was still. He approached slowly, boots sinking into powdery dirt, each step crunching too loud in the silence. Juniper pulled against her tether, eyes rolling white, her body trembling with a strength that made the rope creak. Caleb raised the lantern, its glow catching the rough stones of the well. For a breath, he thought he saw something. A shimmer deep within. A glint like water catching moonlight. But then it was gone, leaving only darkness and the sound of his own heartbeat. He turned back toward the cabin. Behind him, the cottonwoods shifted, though the air was dead calm. A dry rattle of branches scraped like bones. Caleb's throat tightened. He forced himself to breathe, to steady his grip on the lantern, and crossed back to Juniper. The mare pressed against him, hot breath rushing over his shoulder, the tremor of her body shuddering into his bones. "Easy," he whispered, though the word cracked in his throat. He stroked her neck. Each motion meant as much for himself as for her. Her ears twitched toward the trees again, and he followed her gaze. In the distance, just beyond the line of cottonwoods, a faint light pulsed once, soft, then gone. Caleb blinked, waiting for it to return, but the dark held fast. He tethered Juniper closer to the cabin porch, where the lantern's glow could reach her. Still she paced, restless, her hooves cutting lines into the dirt. Caleb sat on the porch steps, rifle across his knees, and listened to the night. The land gave nothing back but silence, as if it had swallowed its own voice. Hours dragged. He dozed in brief snatches, waking each time Juniper stamped or the cabin groaned. Once, near midnight, a hollow thud rolled under the ground, subtle but undeniable. Caleb rose at once, lantern high, scanning the yard. Nothing moved. Yet Juniper stood rigid, her eyes locked on the well, her body drawn tight as a bow. Caleb's mouth went dry. He stared into the dark circle of the well, then turned slowly back to the cabin. He set the lantern on the porch and whispered, almost to himself, "Not tonight." The words hung thin in the cool air, fragile but firm. Juniper blew through her nostrils, a sharp exhale that carried both relief and warning. Caleb laid a hand against her trembling side and stayed there, feeling her heartbeat race against his palm. Above them, the moon drifted behind a veil of clouds, and the ranch sank deeper into shadow. He returned inside before dawn, though sleep never came. And when the first pale light touched the ridges, he knew with bone-deep certainty that the land was not merely abandoned. It was watching. Morning broke gray and cool, the kind of dawn that carried no warmth despite the sun edging over the ridges. Caleb Mason stepped out of the cabin, his eyes gritty from a night without rest. Juniper stood near the porch, head high, ears pricked, her body still tense, as if the darkness clung to her even under daylight. Caleb stroked her neck, whispering something low, but her muscles quivered at his touch. Whatever haunted the ranch had not lifted with the night. He spent the first hours of daylight in work, splitting kindling, clearing brush, mending another section of the fence. Labor gave rhythm, and rhythm gave calm, but the unease beneath his ribs would not leave. When he paused, he saw Juniper staring again toward the cottonwoods, the same trees that had rattled in the stillness the night before. Her eyes seemed to ask questions he could not answer. By mid-morning, a figure approached along the dirt road. Caleb shaded his eyes, the glare off the valley dust making the shape waver. It was a woman walking with a cane carved from aspen, her steps slow but steady. Her long skirt trailed the ground, and her hair, the color of snow, caught the light like spun thread. When she reached the gate, she rested one hand on the weathered wood and looked at him with eyes as dark as turned earth. "You are Mason," she said, her voice soft but sure. Caleb nodded. "And you are?" "Ada 2 Moons," she replied. "My people once lived along this valley before the fences, before the plows. I heard someone had bought the cursed land. I came to see." Caleb felt Juniper shift behind him, blowing a nervous breath. He placed a hand against her shoulder, grounding them both. "You came a long way to warn me, Ada 2 Moons." Her gaze traveled past him to the well, its frame bleached and crooked in the yard. "Warnings are wasted on men who think they can tame ground that remembers too much." She stepped closer, the cane striking softly against the dirt. "But I did not come to frighten you. I came to tell you what the land will not." Caleb listened as Ada moved to the cottonwoods. She laid her palm against the bark of the oldest tree, whispering in a tongue he did not know. The wind stirred gently, though the valley had been still. "This tree is older than your cabin," she said, "older than any boundary marked on paper. It grew beside the creek when water still sang here. My grandfather said the earth below held a river, running bright as glass. The settlers dug the well to drink from it. But something changed. The water turned bitter, livestock sickened, and the people left." Caleb frowned, remembering the sour smell when he lifted water in his palm. "What changed it?" Ada's eyes met his, steady and sad. "Not spirits. Not curses. Men. They cut into the land too deep, searching for more than they needed. The river beneath was broken, forced aside, swallowed into hollows that should never have been opened. When a place is wounded, it remembers." Juniper pawed the ground, her hoof striking with a hollow sound. Ada turned her gaze to the mare. "She knows," she said simply. "Horses always know. They feel the earth through their bones. She will not drink because she hears what you do not." Caleb stroked Juniper's neck, the truth of Ada's words settling heavy in his chest. "Then what do I do?" "Listen," Ada replied. "Listen to the ground, to the water, to her. She reached into the pocket of her shawl and drew out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She unfolded it to reveal a fragment of old pottery, painted with faded red lines that spiraled like waves. This was dug near here many years ago. It belonged to the ones who came before. They carried stories of rivers beneath rivers, of songs in the earth. My grandfather told me the song grows quiet when the land is hurt. Sometimes, if you are still, you may hear it try to rise again. Caleb accepted the shard, its surface warm from her hand. He turned it over, feeling the weight of history pressed into clay. "Why bring this to me?" Ada's eyes softened, though they held no illusions. "Because you are stubborn enough to stay. Most men who touched this place fled, but you carry loss in your silence. Loss makes some men run and others stand. Which are you, Mason?" He had no answer, not one he trusted enough to speak. The memory of Vermont's floods pressed sharp in his chest. He closed his fist around the shard and slipped it into his pocket. "I'll stay," he said finally. "I didn't come to run." Ada nodded once, as if she had known his answer before he gave it. "Then remember this. The ground is not your enemy. But if you ignore its wounds, it will not forgive you." She turned back toward the road, her cane striking a patient rhythm in the dust. Caleb watched her go, the valley wide and empty again. He glanced at Bess, Juniper, who had settled slightly, though her ears still pointed toward the well. He felt the shard heavy in his pocket, and the silence heavier still. For the first time, he wondered if the land was not cursed, but simply waiting for someone willing to listen. That night, when the stars returned and the cottonwoods whispered in the dark, Caleb sat on the porch beside Juniper. He closed his eyes, letting the silence stretch. And though he could not name it, he thought he heard something faint beneath the stillness. A hum, a rhythm, like water moving far underground. The following afternoon, the sky carried the dull haze of late summer heat. Caleb had spent the morning repairing a hinge on the cabin door, but his thoughts were scattered, drifting back to Ada 2 Moons and her words about songs in the earth. Each time he passed the cottonwoods, he slipped a hand into his pocket to feel the shard of pottery she had given him. It was only clay, yet it seemed to vibrate faintly, as though it remembered something his ears could not. Juniper grazed near the edge of the yard, calmer than she had been in days, though her ears still twitched toward the well. Caleb had learned not to press her. He had seen enough to know she trusted her instincts more than he trusted his own. It was near sundown when he heard the crunch of footsteps on gravel. A boy approached, lanky and sunburned, a camera swinging from his neck. He stopped at the fence, eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and hesitation. "You're the man who bought the ranch," the boy said. His voice carried the accent of someone from further south, words colored by heat and desert. Caleb straightened, nodding once. "And you are?" "Mateo Ruiz. My mama runs the boarding house in town. We moved here from New Mexico." He lifted the camera slightly, a shy smile flickering. "I take pictures. Birds mostly. Hawks, owls, cranes when they fly over. Last night I was near here, and, well, I thought you should see." He unzipped his satchel and drew out a stack of glossy prints. Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans and accepted them. The photographs were crisp despite the boy's young age. The first few showed hawks wheeling against the sunset, wings spread wide. But then Caleb stilled. One image, taken after dark, captured a faint line of light running across the valley floor. It wasn't lightning, nor the glow of lanterns. It was thin, steady, almost mechanical. "What time was this?" Caleb asked, his voice low. "Just after midnight. I stayed up to catch the owls, but then I saw the ground glowing. I thought my lens was playing tricks, but when I took another..." Mateo shuffled through and handed over a second photograph. The same light, a pale thread stretching along the ridge. "It was moving, like it was alive. I followed it with the lens until it disappeared near the cottonwoods." Juniper lifted her head sharply, ears pricked, as if confirming the boy's words. She stamped once and blew through her nostrils. Caleb felt the chill of her reaction run up his spine. "You tell anyone else about this?" he asked. Mateo shook his head. "No one listens to me. They just say I've got a wild imagination." He hesitated, then added, "But you've seen it too, haven't you?" Caleb glanced toward the well, its frame standing silent in the fading light. He thought of the rope swaying when the air was still, the hollow thud that rolled through the ground. He handed the photographs back slowly. "I've seen enough to know you're not making it up." The boy's eyes brightened, relief softening his shoulders. "I knew it. I knew someone else could see." For a moment, silence hung between them. Then Mateo raised his camera and aimed it toward Juniper. "She's beautiful," he said. "Not just her color. She looks like she knows more than we do." Caleb allowed himself the faintest smile. "She does." As the boy snapped a picture, Juniper's ears twitched, and she stepped forward, nostrils flaring. Her body turned toward the cottonwoods again. Caleb followed her gaze. The last of the daylight faded, and for a heartbeat, he thought he saw it. A shimmer running low across the valley, faint but real, like veins of fire beneath the earth. When he blinked, it was gone. Mateo lowered his camera, his face pale. "You saw it, didn't you?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the dark line of trees, his hand resting on Juniper's withers. The mare trembled, then pressed closer, as though demanding he acknowledge what she felt. Finally, he nodded. "I saw it." The boy looked both frightened and exhilarated. "Then it's not a story. It's there, underneath." Juniper let out a soft whinny, not sharp with fear, but restless, urgent, as though urging Caleb to act. He stroked her neck, his own breath uneven. "Not tonight," he murmured, echoing the words he had spoken before. "But soon." Mateo slung the camera back around his neck. "If you want help," he said quietly, "I can show you where the light begins. I marked it on the ridge. No one goes there. They're afraid. But I'm not." Caleb studied him, the boldness of youth shadowed by the loneliness in his eyes. He thought of Ada's words, "Some men run, others stand." Perhaps the same was true for boys. He nodded once, slow and deliberate. "Come back tomorrow. We'll see it together." The boy's smile was fleeting, uncertain, but real. He touched the brim of his cap in a gesture older than his years, and started back toward town. Caleb stood in the yard long after he had gone. Juniper pressed against his shoulder, her ears still tilted toward the cottonwoods. The photographs burned in his mind, the faint thread of light carved into the valley floor. The land was speaking in ways too many had chosen to ignore. He tightened his grip on the reins and whispered into the cooling night, "I'm listening." The wind carried a faint chill that night, rattling loose shingles on the cabin roof. Caleb sat by the lantern's glow, the photographs Mateo had shown him spread across the table. The images burned with their quiet truth. threads of light across the valley, something shifting beneath the earth. But it wasn't the mystery of Hollow Creek that pressed hardest on him now. It was the silence inside himself, the one he had carried west from Vermont like a stone in his chest. Juniper stood outside, her shadow visible through the window. Every so often she stamped, restless, as though sensing his unease. Caleb rubbed a hand over his face, his palms rough with calluses. He could fix fences, mend boards, even listen to the warnings of strangers, but he could not mend the hole that lived where his heart used to beat steady. He poured water from the jug into a tin cup and raised it halfway, then stopped. The smell was faintly sour, like metal left too long in the rain. He set it aside, untouched. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a locket, its chain broken, the surface dented from years of wear. He flipped it open, and the face of his wife looked back at him. Soft eyes, smile caught forever in the photograph. The memory rose swift and sharp, the floodwaters rushing through the narrow valley in Vermont, rain hammering roofs until they collapsed, the river swollen beyond its banks. He had held her hand, shouted her name, but the current had taken her before he could pull her free. He had stood knee-deep in water that smelled of mud and death, helpless as her body vanished into the torrent. No grave to visit, no stone to mark her, just water, endless and merciless. He closed the locket and pressed it hard against his chest, his breath breaking in uneven rhythm. "I couldn't save you," he whispered, words so quiet they barely stirred the air. The door creaked. Caleb startled, half rising, but it was only the wind tugging at the frame. He sank back down, the rifle on the wall catching his eye. Out here in Montana, people respected a man who carried his silence like armor. But silence did not heal. It only buried. Outside, Juniper whinnied sharply, pulling him from the spiral. Caleb stepped into the yard, lantern held high. The mare was pacing, her hooves cutting grooves into the earth. When she saw him, she stopped, ears tilting toward him as though she had heard his confession through the walls. He walked to her side, set the lantern down, and pressed his forehead against her warm neck. "You've got scars, too," he murmured, tracing the faint ridge along her shoulder where her coat grew uneven. "We both carry what won't heal." Juniper shifted, then stood still, her breath slow against his cheek. It wasn't comfort, not exactly, but it was presence, a reminder that he was not as alone as the valley tried to make him believe. For a long time, he stayed like that, the night cool around them, the stars sharp above. He thought of Ada's question. "Are you the kind of man who runs, or the kind who stands?" He thought of Mateo, young and eager, willing to follow threads of light no one else would believe in. And he thought of Lila Hart, her steady voice reminding him to trust his horse. Caleb straightened slowly, his hand lingering on Juniper's mane. "We'll face it," he said, his voice stronger now. "Not just for me. Not just for you. For this place. For the truth it's been forced to hide." Juniper pawed once at the ground, then stilled as though sealing the vow. Caleb lifted the lantern, its glow trembling against the well in the distance. Shadows clung to the stones, but they no longer seemed untouchable. The wound inside him still throbbed, raw as ever. Yet for the first time in years, he felt the faint edge of resolve pushing back against the dark. He returned to the cabin and set the locket on the table beside Mateo's photographs. Two truths side by side, the wife he had lost and the land he had yet to uncover. Both demanded courage. Both demanded he stop running. He doused the lantern, lay on his bedroll, and stared into the dark until the first pale hint of dawn seeped through the cracks. Sleep never came. But neither did the old despair. Instead, something steadier filled his chest. A readiness, quiet and stubborn. The wound would never heal. He knew that. But perhaps it could teach him how to fight. The morning broke with a wind that smelled of sage and dust. Caleb stood outside the cabin, tightening the cinch on Juniper's saddle, his mind restless from another sleepless night. The photographs from Mateo, Ada's pottery shard, and his own memories weighed together in his pocket like stones. The valley whispered in its silence, daring him to act. Juniper stamped impatiently, ears pointed toward the cottonwoods as if she had already chosen their path. "Show me then," Caleb muttered. His voice was rough, but there was a steadiness beneath it. He loosened the reins and let her step forward. Juniper moved with purpose, not the nervous pacing of before, but a deliberate stride, each hoof digging into the dry ground as though she knew the trail by memory. They crossed the yard and entered the tall grass, the stalks brushing against Caleb's boots. The cottonwoods loomed closer, their leaves rustling in a voice older than language. Juniper paused at the base of the largest tree, sniffed the earth, and pawed sharply. Caleb dismounted, crouched, and pressed his palm against the soil. The ground felt oddly warm despite the morning chill, as though something beneath breathed its own heat. Juniper shifted, tugging the reins, then moved northward along the line of trees. Caleb followed on foot, his boots crunching, the leather reins tight in his hand. She stopped again at a shallow depression in the ground where the grass grew thin and brittle. She lowered her head, sniffed, then dug with her hoof until dust lifted in pale clouds. Caleb knelt, brushing aside, loose soil, and uncovered a flat slab of concrete, edges cracked and half swallowed by roots. His throat tightened. "What are you trying to show me, girl?" He scraped more dirt away with his hands until the shape became clearer. A hatch, old but not natural. Iron hinges rusted along one side, a metal handle corroded nearly to powder. Caleb tugged, but it wouldn't budge. Juniper let out a sharp breath, pulling back as if urging him to leave it buried. He sat back on his heels, staring at the hatch. Ada's words echoed. "If you ignore the land's wounds, it will not forgive you." He glanced toward the ridge, remembering Mateo's photographs of light streaking beneath the soil. Whatever lay under here was not just history. It was alive. And it was still moving. Juniper stepped sideways, her hoof catching the edge of the slab with a hollow clang. Caleb startled, then laughed under his breath, a sound without humor. "All right," he said. "You've made your point." He returned to the cabin for tools, a crowbar, a shovel, and a coil of rope. By the time he came back, the sun stood higher, heating the air until it shimmered. He wedged the crowbar into the crack and pushed. The metal groaned, then gave way, the hatch lifting an inch before catching. A smell rose, sharp and chemical, biting the back of his throat. Juniper recoiled, snorting furiously, her eyes wide. Caleb coughed, dragging his bandana over his nose. He forced the hatch open farther, revealing a narrow shaft dropping into darkness. The air was hot, and from below came the faint hum of machinery. He froze. Machinery did not belong in a forgotten ranch. He lowered the lantern on the rope, its glow swinging as it disappeared into the hole. The light caught glints of water pooled against concrete, pipes running at angles into the earth, and something else. Marks on the walls like gouges left by tools. Caleb pulled the lantern back up and closed the hatch slowly. He wiped his palms against his jeans, the grime sticking to his skin. The truth was louder now. This ranch wasn't haunted by spirits. It was scarred by men. Someone had carved tunnels beneath it, siphoning off water, leaving the surface to dry and rot. Mateo's photographs weren't tricks of the lens. The glowing lines were real, evidence of machines working in the belly of the valley. Juniper stood stiff, her body angled protectively between Caleb and the hatch. Her breath came sharp and fast, but her eyes never left his face. Caleb stroked her mane, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "You found it. You knew." The mare leaned into him for a moment, then snorted, pawing the ground again, as though insisting there was more to see. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He felt the old wound in his chest, the one that refused to heal, and beneath it, a new resolve. He could not undo the flood that had taken his wife, but he could stand here and face what this land had hidden. He tied the hatch shut with rope and covered it with brush. Then he swung into the saddle, turned Juniper toward the ridge, and let her choose the pace. She moved with purpose again, carrying him past the cottonwoods and out into the open valley. As the sun leaned westward, Caleb looked back once. The cabin, the well, the cottonwoods, all stood silent, ordinary to any passer-by. But he knew now the truth was beneath, humming like a buried heart. Juniper tossed her head, impatient to move on. Caleb touched her neck, murmured low, "All right, girl, lead the way." And together they rode into the lengthening shadows, toward a truth that refused to stay buried. The next morning dawned clear, the air unusually still after a night of restless winds. Caleb walked the perimeter of the yard, his boots pressing shallow prints in the dust. Juniper followed at a distance, ears swiveling with each creak of the ranch, her muscles taut, as though she expected the ground itself to shift beneath them. Caleb's mind remained fixed on the hatch hidden under the cottonwoods. He could still smell the chemical sting rising from that shaft, still hear the faint thrum of machinery where no machine should be. He was hauling a bundle of kindling toward the cabin when the first sign of trouble arrived. The rhythmic beat of hooves, steady and unhurried, carrying the confidence of a man who belonged wherever he chose to ride. Caleb squinted into the glare. A rider approached on a tall bay horse, its coat gleaming as though brushed that very morning. The man in the saddle wore a dark suit despite the heat, the brim of his felt hat cutting sharp lines across his face. When he reined in at the yard's edge, dust billowed around him, gold in the rising sun. He tipped his hat with a smile too polished to be friendly. "Mr. Mason," he called, his voice smooth as silk stretched over steel. "Name's Trent Hollis. Word travels fast in Madison. You've stirred up quite the curiosity." Caleb set down the bundle of wood and straightened. Juniper lifted her head, ears pinned back, a low snort rumbling from her chest. Caleb felt the tension run through her and laid a calming hand on her neck. "Curiosity's cheap," he said evenly. "What brings you here?" Hollis swung down from his horse with the ease of a man accustomed to commanding attention. Dust clung to the cuffs of his trousers, but the rest of him looked untouched by the ride. He walked a slow circle, his boots tracing the boundary of the yard as his eyes swept over the cabin, the stable, the well. Each glance lingered, measuring value, tallying opportunity. "I make it my business," Hollis said, "to recognize potential where others see ruin. You, sir, have purchased a property most would have left to rot. Yet I see possibility. Mason Creek Ranch sits on land that could, let's say, expand into something profitable. Water rights alone are worth a fortune." He smiled, showing teeth too white, too deliberate. "I'd like to make you an offer." Caleb folded his arms. "You've ridden out early for business." "Business doesn't sleep." Hollis reached into his coat and drew out a small leather pouch. He tossed it lightly, and it landed with a dull clink in Caleb's hand. Coins. More money than Caleb had seen in months. $100 for your deed. Cash, no strings. That's 10 times what you paid, and then some. Caleb studied the pouch, then closed his fist and set it on the porch rail. "Not interested." The smile on Hollis's face held, but his eyes narrowed. "I admire loyalty to a dream, but let's not mistake stubbornness for strength. A man who holds land like this risks more than money. There are reasons no one else dared buy it, reasons whispered in saloons and at supper tables. You've heard them, I'm sure." Juniper stamped, her hooves striking sharp against the packed earth. Hollis glanced at her, his smile thinning. "Fine mare you've got there. Shame if she suffered the same fate as others before her. This land has a history of loss." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "I said I'm not interested." Hollis took a step closer, the gleam of his watch chain catching the sun. 200, cash. Today. Walk away richer than you came." Caleb's voice dropped, quiet but immovable. "The land's not for sale." For the first time, Hollis's smile faltered. His eyes lost their sheen of charm, revealing a colder glint beneath. He let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing like heat. Then he straightened his coat, replaced his hat, and gave a short nod. "You've spirit, Mr. Mason. I'll give you that. But spirit doesn't pay debts, and it doesn't keep a man safe. Think it over." He mounted with practiced grace, turned his bay horse, and rode off at the same deliberate pace he had arrived, dust curling in his wake. Caleb watched until the figure vanished beyond the ridge. Then he looked at Juniper, who still trembled. Ears pinned tight, nostrils flared as though she had scented a predator. He laid a hand on her mane, his own chest tight. "You're right," he murmured. "There's danger in him." He turned back toward the cabin, the leather pouch of coins still sitting on the rail. He picked it up, weighed it once in his palm, then carried it inside. Without opening it again, he set it on the table beside Mateo's photographs and Ada's shard of pottery. 3 truths now: greed, evidence, and memory, each heavier than the last. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of oil and rust. Caleb froze, his thoughts flashing to the hatch hidden under the cottonwoods. The machinery he had heard below, the glow Mateo had captured on film, it all tied back to Hollis. The man's offer hadn't been generosity. It had been desperation disguised as charm. Juniper whinnied sharply outside, breaking his thoughts. Caleb stepped to the door and looked at her, her head lifted high, eyes fixed on the horizon where Hollis had disappeared. "We're not selling," Caleb said aloud, the words firm as iron. The mare pawed once at the ground, her breath rising in quick bursts. It was not fear anymore, but agreement, a declaration in its own right. The evening settled in slow, the kind of dusk that lingered too long, turning the valley bronze before swallowing it whole. Caleb Mason sat on the porch steps, his elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon where Trent Hollis had disappeared that morning. The pouch of coins still rested on the table inside the cabin, untouched, but its presence gnawed at him like a splinter. Hollis's smile, his talk of potential, the way he had glanced at Juniper, as if she were just another piece of property. None of it left Caleb's mind. Juniper grazed a few yards away, her ears twitching at the smallest sound. She raised her head when the faint clop of hooves echoed down the road. Caleb rose slowly, hand brushing the rifle propped against the doorframe, though he didn't lift it yet. The rider emerged from the growing dark, a man in a deputy's badge, his gray coat flapping with the evening breeze. "Mr. Mason?" Deputy Mark Ward called, his tone cautious, carrying more weariness than authority. Caleb didn't move to greet him. He leaned a shoulder against the post, letting silence fill the space until the deputy dismounted. Ward tied his horse loosely at the fence, though the animal shifted uneasily, nostrils twitching as if it, too, sensed the valley's unrest. "I heard Hollis paid you a visit," Ward said, brushing dust from his gloves. "Figured I should ride out myself." Caleb studied him in the half-light. "And what is it you've come to say?" Ward hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground before lifting again. "Men like Hollis don't take no for an answer. You turn down his offer, he'll press harder. You sell, you'll be rid of him. You don't—" His voice trailed, his jaw working as though chewing words too bitter to swallow. Juniper stepped closer to Caleb, her body angled between him and the deputy. Ward's eyes flicked to the mare, then back to Caleb. "Fine horse you've got. Keep her close." Caleb's chest tightened. "Is that a warning?" Ward shifted uncomfortably. "It's advice." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He laid it on the porch rail, the edges soft from handling. "This here's an old survey map. Shows water lines, drainage, rights of way. Some of those lines cross through your property. At least they used to. Folks stopped marking them after the place was abandoned." Caleb unfolded the paper. The ink was faded, but he traced the lines with his finger. They ran like veins across the land, some ending near the well, others disappearing into the cottonwoods. His throat went dry. This was more than rumor, more than ghost stories whispered in saloons. Ward cleared his throat. "There's things best left buried, Mason. Take your profit and go. That's the smart choice." Caleb folded the map carefully, slid it into his pocket, and met the deputy's eyes. "You've seen what's under there, haven't you?" Ward didn't answer right away. His gaze shifted toward the cottonwoods, their branches black against the dying sky. Finally, he said, "I've seen enough to know Hollis isn't working alone. He's got men, money too. And if you think you can stand in their way with nothing but stubborn pride, you'll be chewed up same as the last man who tried." "Who was that?" Caleb pressed. The deputy's eyes hardened. "Doesn't matter. He's gone. Just remember, Hollis doesn't like loose ends." Juniper pawed the ground, snorting sharply, her ears pinned flat. The sound made Ward flinch, though he tried to mask it. Caleb stroked her neck, steadying her, then turned his gaze back on the deputy. "I didn't buy this land to sell it off. Whatever's underneath, it belongs to the truth. Not to Hollis. Not to you." Ward's shoulders sagged, his voice lowering. "Then watch your back. Watch your horse. And don't expect the law to save you when the time comes." He tugged his reins, mounted, and rode off, his figure swallowed quickly by the dark. The valley returned to silence, but it was heavier now, like a storm waiting to break. Caleb stood with his hand on Juniper's mane, feeling the tremor beneath her skin. He drew the folded map from his pocket, studied it once more in the lantern's glow, and whispered, "So that's where the fight begins." Juniper blew hard, stamping once, her eyes fixed on the cottonwoods. Caleb looked into the dark line of trees, his jaw set. The half-warning had been enough. He knew now he couldn't walk away. The storm had not yet come, but the air felt charged with its approach. Caleb Mason woke before dawn, his body stiff from too many nights spent in half-sleep. Juniper stood tethered near the porch, her head lifted high, ears flicking at sounds he could not hear. The valley seemed to hold its breath, waiting. He saddled Juniper and rode the boundary of the property, tracing the lines Deputy Ward's map had marked. The paper, folded into his coat, weighed more than it should. Streams that once ran through gullies were dry, leaving cracked earth like veins across the land. Birds avoided the fields, and even the wind seemed to circle around the cottonwoods instead of through them. By mid-morning, the temperature climbed. Caleb loosened his collar, but sweat clung to his back. Juniper grew restless, tossing her head, hooves striking hard against the ground. When they neared the hollow where the hatch lay buried, she froze, nostrils flaring. The earth beneath them shivered, faint at first, then stronger. Caleb tightened his grip on the reins as the tremor rolled underfoot like a wave. Juniper reared, neighing sharp enough to echo through the valley. Caleb held fast, speaking low, but the words came out thin. The ground trembled again, a hollow vibration, and from the cottonwoods came the metallic clatter of something shifting deep underground. Caleb dismounted, crouching low to steady Juniper by the reins. He pressed his palm against the soil. Heat pulsed through the ground, unnatural, alive. He thought of the hum he had heard when he opened the hatch, the sour chemical smell. Machinery. Someone was running pumps below, and they had stirred the earth awake. A shout carried across the windless air. Caleb turned to see Mateo scrambling down the ridge, camera bouncing against his chest. The boy's face was pale, his breath ragged. "It's happening again," he cried. "I saw the lights, bright, moving faster than before. And then the ground shook." He skidded to a stop beside them, clutching his knees. Caleb steadied Juniper with one hand and grabbed Mateo's shoulder with the other. "Where exactly?" Mateo pointed toward the far ridge. "Just there, near the dry creek bed. The whole slope glowed. I thought it was fire, but there was no smoke." Another tremor rippled underfoot. Juniper lunged sideways, nearly pulling the reins from Caleb's hands. Her eyes rolled white, her body straining to run. Caleb wrapped an arm around her neck, pressing his weight against her until she steadied. "We're not leaving," Caleb said aloud, more to himself than to the boy or the horse. "Not until we know what's beneath us." Mateo swallowed hard, glancing at Juniper. "She wants to go. She's trying to warn you." "She's trying to show me," Caleb corrected, though fear tightened his throat. He patted Juniper's trembling flank. "Easy, girl. Take us where we need to see." The mare hesitated, then pulled forward, ears fixed on the ridge. Caleb mounted quickly, reaching a hand down for Mateo. The boy swung up behind him, clinging tight. Together they rode across the valley floor, the hooves pounding like a drumbeat over earth that seemed to quake with every strike. As they neared the dry creek, the tremors grew stronger. Dust lifted in thin veils, and pebbles rolled across the cracked surface. Juniper balked, then pressed forward, each step a battle against her own fear. At the creek's edge, she halted, snorting wildly. Caleb looked down. The soil here was fractured, jagged lines running in circles, as if something beneath had churned the ground like water. Matteo slid off, snapping a photograph despite the tremor shaking his hands. The camera clicked, freezing the glow that pulsed faintly through the cracks. "It's real," he whispered. "It's alive." Caleb crouched low, touched the dirt. The heat burned his fingertips. He pulled back, his pulse hammering. "It's not alive," he said. "It's stolen. Someone's bleeding this land dry." The ground lurched violently, throwing them off balance. Juniper screamed, hooves striking sparks against stone, and bolted a few steps before Caleb caught the reins. Dust swirled up, thick and choking, while the earth groaned like an old beast turning in its sleep. Then, as suddenly as it began, the tremors stilled. The valley returned to silence, broken only by Juniper's ragged breathing and Matteo's camera clicking one last time. The boy lowered the lens, his face pale. "If Hollis is behind this, it's not just water he's after, it's the whole valley." Caleb stared at the cracked ground, the glow fading beneath the soil. His fists tightened around the reins. "Then we're standing on a wound they mean to keep open." Juniper pressed her muzzle into his shoulder, trembling. Caleb stroked her mane, his voice steady despite the fear running cold through him. "We won't let them. Not you, not me, not this land." He looked at Matteo, who clutched the camera like a shield. "You keep those pictures safe. They're proof." Matteo nodded, his jaw set with a determination beyond his years. Together they turned back toward the ranch, Juniper's hooves striking the ground in defiance, each step a vow. Behind them, the dry creek bed lay cracked and silent, but Caleb knew it would not stay that way for long. The ground had spoken, and its voice was a warning. The storm arrived without warning. Clouds that had been thin and white at dawn gathered by noon into a wall of steel, their edges torn by wind. Caleb Mason had seen enough summers in Montana to know the sky could change its mind in a breath, but nothing prepared him for the violence of this turn. The air grew heavy, pressing against his skin, and the silence before the first crack of thunder was so deep it made Juniper quiver. He had ridden with Matteo to the ridge, hoping to trace the fault lines where the ground had trembled the day before. They had barely reached the slope when the sky split open. Rain came down in sheets, hard and sudden, drenching them before they could turn back. Matteo clutched his camera under his jacket, teeth clenched as the water streamed down his face. "Head for the cottonwoods!" Caleb shouted over the roar, tugging Juniper's reins. But Juniper refused, pulling toward the dry creek bed instead, nostrils flared, eyes wide with alarm. "Not that way, girl," Caleb urged, but she yanked harder, nearly unseating him. He glanced toward the gully and saw why. Water, thick and red with earth, rushing down the dry bed like a beast set free. In the torrent's path stood a figure, Matteo, who had slipped in his scramble down the slope. His feet slid out from under him, the mud carrying him toward the oncoming flood. Caleb leapt from the saddle before thought could catch him. "Matteo!" he shouted, stumbling through the rain. The boy clawed at the mud, eyes wide with terror. The water roared closer, a wall that would sweep him away in seconds. Juniper screamed, a sound that cut through the storm like steel on stone. She surged forward without command, her hooves striking sparks from the wet rock. Caleb reached for her reins, but she was already moving, charging down the slope toward the boy. Mud flew as she slid to a stop, planting herself between Matteo and the torrent. She reared once, then dropped her weight into the earth, muscles straining as though she could hold back the flood itself. "Grab her!" Caleb roared. Mateo reached up, clutching the saddle horn with both hands, his fingers white-knuckled. Caleb threw himself forward, locking an arm around the boy's waist just as the first surge of water struck Juniper's legs. The mare staggered, her scream lost in the thunder, but she held. Mud and water splashed high, drenching them in a spray of grit. Caleb dragged Mateo upward, shoving him against the bank. Juniper lurched, one leg slipping, and Caleb saw blood streak down her shoulder where a sharp stone had torn her skin. He grabbed the reins, pulling with everything he had. "Come on, girl! Hold steady!" The mare dug deep, hooves tearing into the ground until they found purchase. With one final heave, she pulled herself clear of the flood's edge, sides heaving, her breath ragged in the rain. Caleb pressed his forehead to her wet mane, whispering hoarsely, "You saved him. You saved us both." Mateo coughed, mud streaking his face, his camera miraculously still clutched to his chest. His eyes were wide, not with fear now, but awe. He looked at Juniper as if seeing something holy. She knew," he gasped. "She went straight for me." Caleb helped him to his feet, steadying him with one hand, while the other never left Juniper's trembling flank. The rain eased slightly, turning from sheets to heavy drops, the thunder rolling farther away. But the creek bed still foamed with water, and Caleb knew how close they had come to losing everything. He tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it against Juniper's wound. Blood seeped through, diluted by the rain, but the cut was shallow enough to bind. The mare stood steady, though her sides quivered with exhaustion. She lowered her head, pressing her muzzle into Caleb's chest, her breath hot even in the chill. "You did more than any man could," Caleb whispered. "And you didn't hesitate." Mateo's voice broke into the moment, soft but firm. "I'll never tell anyone she's just a horse again. She's more than that. She's the reason I'm alive." Caleb met the boy's eyes, saw the truth of it, and nodded. "You owe her your life. We both do." The rain thinned to a drizzle. The storm left behind a silence heavy with the smell of wet earth and pine. Caleb guided Juniper back up the slope, Mateo close behind, his steps steadier now. At the top, they paused, looking back at the creek bed. The water still rushed, but already it seemed less monstrous, as though it had spent its rage. Caleb rested a hand on Juniper's neck. Her coat was soaked, her muscles trembling, but her ears flicked forward, alert and proud. He knew she carried her own fear of water, the memory of sickness and thirst from before she was his, yet she had plunged straight into the torrent, not for herself, but for the boy. It was more than instinct. It was choice. As they returned to the cabin, Mateo walked beside Juniper, his hand resting lightly on her side. The boy's camera swung forgotten against his chest. "She didn't just rescue me," he said quietly. "She chose to." Caleb glanced at the mare, at the blood-stained strip of cloth pressed against her shoulder. His throat tightened, but his voice was steady. "Then we'll choose her, every day from here on, whatever comes." Juniper lifted her head, ears catching the fading wind. She stepped lighter despite her wound, as though the storm had given her strength rather than stolen it. Caleb knew then that the ranch's battle was no longer his alone. Juniper had claimed it too, with courage written in blood and rain. The storm passed, but its echo lingered. The next morning the valley smelled of wet sage and split earth, a scent both sharp and strangely clean. Puddles shimmered in low places where dust had ruled for years, and the cottonwoods dripped as though they had been wrung out by unseen hands. Caleb Mason stood with Juniper at the edge of the yard, watching the well. For the first time since he had set foot on the ranch, He heard a sound from it, not the dry creak of rope, but a faint gurgle, hesitant, like a throat clearing after silence. Juniper lifted her head, ears tilted forward. She did not recoil as she had before. Instead, she stepped closer, nostrils flaring, her hooves cautious but steady. Caleb followed, his boots sinking slightly in the damp soil. He leaned over the stone lip and listened. The water below shifted faintly, reflecting the pale morning light. A note, low and resonant, seemed to rise from the depths. He closed his eyes, and for an instant it was as if the earth itself was humming. Behind him, Mateo appeared, his hair still damp, his camera hanging at his side. "It's different today," the boy said quietly, like the storm woke it up. Caleb nodded, his hand brushing the worn stones. Maybe it remembered itself. They drew water together, the bucket heavier than before. When Caleb lifted it, the liquid gleamed clear, not clouded or sour. He raised it to his lips, hesitated, then took a slow sip. The taste was sharp, mineral-rich, clean enough to sting his throat. He exhaled, the tightness in his chest easing. "It's water," he whispered. "Real water again." Juniper stepped closer, her breath warm against his shoulder. Caleb lowered the bucket. The mare bent her head, sniffed once, then drank. Her throat worked steadily. No hesitation, no fear. Mateo's eyes widened, shining with awe. "She trusts it now," he said. Caleb's voice grew rough. "She trusts what the land has given back." Later that day, they followed the lines marked on Ward's map, tracing where the storm had washed. The earth thin. Small rivulets trickled through gullies that had been dry, carving paths that led toward the cottonwoods. In several places, pipes jutted through fractured soil, metal gleaming wet where water should have run free. Hollis's theft was laid bare, his machinery exposed by the storm's hand. At one break, water gushed in a silver arc, soaking the ground until it turned to mud. Caleb crouched beside it, running his fingers through the stream. The coldness bit into his skin, yet it felt like a blessing. He glanced at Mateo, who snapped photographs in quick succession. "This is proof," Caleb said. "Not just stories. They can't bury this." Juniper pawed at the ground beside the pipe, her body tense but no longer in panic. She threw her head once, mane scattering droplets, and whinnied, a sound bright, almost triumphant. Mateo lowered his camera slowly. "It's like she's singing with it," he murmured. As dusk settled, Caleb sat on the porch with Ada's pottery shard in one hand, listening to the valley. The cottonwoods rustled in a softer voice, their branches dripping rhythmically. From the well came the steady sound of water returning to its place. He thought of Ada's words, "The song grows quiet when the land is hurt. Sometimes, if you are still, you may hear it try to rise again." Juniper stood nearby, her scarred shoulder catching the last light. She turned her head toward him, eyes steady, ears relaxed. Caleb whispered, "It's singing now. I can hear it." The mare snorted gently, lowering her head until her muzzle brushed his sleeve. It was not just comfort, it was acknowledgement, as though she too had been waiting for the song to return. The night closed around them, not heavy as before, but alive, filled with the hush of water moving beneath the soil. Caleb leaned back, the shard warm in his palm, the boy's photographs safe inside the cabin, and Juniper's quiet breath, steady in his ear. For the first time since he had arrived, the valley did not feel like it was watching him. It felt like it was welcoming him home. The valley had changed. It wasn't dramatic, not the kind of change that would catch the eye of strangers passing through, but Caleb Mason could feel it in the ground beneath his boots and in the air that carried a freshness he hadn't known since his first night at the ranch. The storm had ripped something open, and now the earth seemed to breathe easier. Caleb stood at the well with Juniper at his side. The rope creaked as the bucket descended, the sound different than before, less hollow, more alive. He drew it up slowly, water sloshing against the wood, clear in the lantern light. His hand trembled slightly as he set the bucket on the stones. Juniper lowered her head, her nostrils brushing the rim. Caleb held his breath. For weeks she had shied away, her instincts sharper than any warning words. But now, instead of recoiling, she dipped her muzzle into the water and drank. Her throat moved in a steady rhythm, the sound soft and certain. Caleb's chest tightened as though something inside him had broken loose. Mateo stood a few steps back, his camera hanging forgotten at his side. "She trusts it," he whispered, awe heavy in his voice. "She trusts you." Caleb shook his head, his eyes never leaving the mare. "She trusts the land. I just held on long enough to see it return." When Juniper lifted her head, water dripping from her lips, her eyes met Caleb's. In that gaze was more than survival. It was acceptance, even forgiveness. She pressed her muzzle against his shoulder, her breath warm, her body steady. Caleb closed his eyes, his hand brushing her damp mane. He felt the knot in his chest ease, just a little, as if the scar inside him had loosened. Later, as night settled, Caleb carried a bucket of the clear water inside the cabin. He set it on the table beside Ada's shard of pottery and Mateo's photographs. 3 pieces of truth, the past, the evidence, and the present, all bound together by the sound of water filling what had been empty. He lifted the cup and drank deeply. The taste was sharp, metallic, but pure. For the first time in years, he did not spit it out. He swallowed and let it stay with him. Outside, Mateo and Juniper walked the yard. The boy's laughter rose in soft bursts as the mare nudged him, curious and playful despite the scar along her shoulder. Caleb watched through the window, a faint smile breaking the hardness of his face. This place, once heavy with silence, now carried small sounds of life again. But peace never lasted long in the valley. From the ridge, a column of dust curled upward, faint but deliberate. Riders. Caleb's smile faded. He knew Hollis had not given up. The man had made his offer, and when Caleb refused, the rules had changed. Juniper snorted sharply, ears snapping forward, body shifting into alertness. She turned toward the horizon, stamping once. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, his hand brushing the rifle by the door. The well gurgled behind him, alive again, its voice quiet but steady. He looked at the mare, at the boy, and then at the approaching dust. His jaw tightened. "They'll come for it," he said under his breath. "But they won't take it. Not this time." Juniper blew hard, her breath fogging in the cool night as though sealing the vow. The valley was no longer silent. It carried the sound of water, the sound of promise. And when the first stars lit the sky, Caleb knew the fight for Hollow Creek was no longer just survival. It was belonging. Morning came clear and bright, the kind of morning that sharpened every outline in the valley. The storm was gone, but its work remained. The well alive again, the air heavy with the scent of wet pine and stone. Caleb Mason stood on the porch with Juniper at his side, watching the sun slide across the ridge. He had lived through storms before, but this one had left something behind, not destruction, but renewal. Matteo sat near the stable, repairing a strap on his camera bag, his clothes still stained with mud from the flood. Each time he looked at Juniper, his face softened, as though he were remembering how close death had come and how the mare had stepped between him and the torrent. Caleb noticed it too. He reached down, brushed Juniper's mane, and said, "She carries us all, one way or another." The sound of hooves broke the quiet. From the ridge came riders, Hollis, flanked by men dressed in dust-colored coats, their expressions unreadable. Caleb felt Juniper tense, her ears pinning back. He steadied her with a hand but didn't move to fetch his rifle. He had made his choice the night before. Hollis reined in at the yard's edge, dismounted, and smiled with the same polish he'd worn the first time they met. "Morning, Mason. I see you've made yourself at home. Shame it won't last." Caleb didn't answer. He simply stood with Juniper at his side, the well gurgling softly behind him. Matteo rose, gripping his camera like a weapon. Hollis's smile faltered. "You've meddled in things you don't understand. The pipes, the water. It's worth more than you'll ever dream. You think this land sings for you? It sings for profit, Mason. For progress." Caleb's voice was low, steady. It sings for itself. And it's finished being stolen. Juniper pawed the earth once, a deep, resonant sound that carried through the still air. The men behind Hollis shifted uneasily, their horses restless. Hollis opened his mouth to reply, but the silence pressed back harder than any words Caleb could have spoken. Deputy Ward appeared then, riding alone from the opposite ridge. He looked older than before, his face lined with something heavier than fear. Remorse. He stopped between Caleb and Hollis, his voice carrying clearly. "It's over, Hollis. The evidence is out. The pipes are exposed. The boys' photographs are already on their way to the state office. You can't bury the truth anymore." Matteo lifted his camera, snapping a picture of Hollis in the morning light, his figure caught against the ridge. The shutter's click cut sharp through the quiet. Hollis swore under his breath, swung into the saddle, and turned his horse hard. His men followed, dust rising behind them as they fled the valley they could no longer control. Ward dismounted, walked slowly to Caleb, and removed his badge. He set it on the porch rail. "I should have spoken sooner. Maybe fewer would have suffered if I had. But you held when the rest of us turned away. The land will remember you stood." Caleb said nothing, only nodded once. Juniper exhaled, ears relaxing for the first time in days. The valley itself seemed to ease with her. Weeks passed. Men came not with threats, but with tools. Rangers, engineers, townsfolk ashamed of their silence. The pipes were dug out, dismantled, hauled away. Water flowed back into the creek. Slow at first, then stronger, until the valley greened in places long thought barren. Caleb rebuilt the cabin wall by wall, board by board. Matteo painted the new fence white, laughing when Juniper tried to nip the brush from his hand. Ada visited often, sitting beneath the cottonwoods, telling stories of rivers beneath rivers, smiling when she heard the creek's song rise again. When the work was finished, Caleb stood on the porch of a house no longer broken, Juniper beside him. The evening stretched wide, shadows long across the grass. The well bubbled steady, a sound not of fear, but of belonging. He scratched Juniper's jaw, his voice soft. "We made it, girl. We gave it back its voice." Juniper leaned into his hand, her eyes calm, her body steady. Mateo sat on the fence nearby, camera in his lap, watching the light fade. The valley no longer looked cursed, no longer felt haunted. It looked alive, reborn from the wound men had tried to keep open. As the last light slipped behind the ridge, Caleb breathed deep. For the first time since the flood in Vermont, he felt whole. Not healed, he would never be that, but steady, rooted. He looked at Juniper and Mateo, at the house and the land, and whispered, "This is home." The night closed around them, not in silence, but in song. The steady music of water returning to its place, the heartbeat of a valley that had chosen to forgive. And now I want to hear from you. If you believe Juniper was the true hero of this story, just drop a simple 1 in the comments. If you think Caleb's courage deserves the last word, type 0. Your voice keeps these stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next journey of hope, loss, and the unbreakable bond between people and their horses.